Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Perhaps 2 words in advance. This suit is not a Japanese one, because my Japanese friends always ask me, why are you wearing Bavarian suits? So it's a mixture of both. And the second is, it's really true. It will take 60 minutes, nearly 60 minutes. So if it's too long for you, perhaps you decide now to do something which may be better than listening to a complicated keynote speech. The continental European post-secondary university system is facing fundamental transformation, a process which has to some extent already begun. It was initiated by phenomena such as the Bologna process, a reform of European universities, we all know that, which seemed at first to result from an exclusively European bid for unity in higher education, but which must be seen as part of globalization in the entire post-secondary system in various regions of the world. By adapting certain aspects of the Anglo-American higher education system, the Bologna process as a fundamental reform of the European university system extends well beyond Europe. It induces continental Europe to espouse views of the tertiary sector which have already gained a foothold in North America, parts of Asia, and in some of the emerging countries of other continents. This process may be interpreted as part and parcel of a process of convergence, be it by chance or deliberate, to which other phenomena have also contributed. These include student mobility between European and non-European countries, which has increased by 10% in the last 10 years, numerous university partnerships, 20,000 of which are maintained to varying degrees by German universities, and the emergence of post-secondary joint NGOs such as the European University Association, or beyond Europe, the International Association of Universities and the International Association of University Presidents. The European Education Research Association, in the spirit of its name, can also be seen as part of this process. This process of globalization is happening at a rapid pace without the benefit of international oversight by democratically legitimated organizations. In fact, post-secondary education is essentially governed by a view of education as a commodity. Presumably, this process will accelerate so much in the next 1 to 2 decades that educational systems based on another traditions will virtually disappear. These traditions include the Confucian approach to education seen in East Asia and the continental European understanding of education. Since the end of the 18th century, continental European universities have regarded themselves as institutions of enlightenment, not as institutions for vocational training or commissioned research. As institutions of enlightenment, universities in continental Europe, and especially in Germany, although in France as well, have traditionally felt a twofold commitment to the individual and to society. They serve individuals by providing them with an academic education, and they thereby serve the society which these individuals guide on its path towards humanization. The difference to the Anglo-American understanding of higher education becomes especially clear when we consider some thoughts concerning education by John Locke, one of the fathers of the Atlantic educational idea, a man who saw the education of a gentleman as consisting in 4 qualities: virtue, wisdom, breeding, and knowledge. A person educated according to these precepts behaves in a manner befitting his rank and is to that extent useful. Wilhelm von Humboldt proposed a contrasting view of education in Theory of Bildung, according to which education should cultivate character in young people, committing them to the humanist values and thus also making them capable of educating and advancing society in humanist terms. Those who make decisions in the future about post-secondary education all over the world must consider, on behalf of those they represent, nothing less than whether higher education institutions should serve the moral, political, and social development of a society, by which I mean world society, or whether their primary task is to professionally qualify young people so that they are economically productive. Put bluntly, this is about the relationship between the economic and the moral reproduction of the learning subject. A decision, one way or the other, has the most extensive consequences for future social formation on a global scale. A society in line with a continental European understanding pursues a utopia of the good, not wealthy, but morally acceptable life, while the Atlantic understanding may tend to highlight income. The conditions for and consequences of this difference extend into almost every area of society beyond educational systems and lead to entirely different constitutions and state practices, such as the state's use of information and its citizens' right to self-determination. Should the university view the common good as something beyond a society's economic growth to emphasize its ethical development, even perhaps over and above economic considerations? In this case, what Jacques Derrida said in France as the Bologna reform was beginning to shape the university's mission would be true. I quote from Derrida's The Future of the Profession of the University without condition: "The university must be a place in which nothing is beyond question, not even the current and determined figure of democracy, and not even the traditional idea of critique, meaning theoretical critique, and not even the authority of the question form of thinking and questioning, the principal right to say everything, whether it be under the heading of fiction and the experimentation of knowledge, and the right to say it publicly, to publish it. This reference to the public space will remain the link that affiliates the new humanities to the age of enlightenment." End of quote. If the globalization process in the post-secondary sector, with the opportunities and risks this process entails, is not simply to be left to the working of the market, then we must investigate the convergences which we can reasonably expect to develop naturally, as it were, without intervention from democratically legitimated organizations. This means looking at the inherent qualities and dynamics of the 3 great educational systems, the continental, European, the Atlantic, and the East Asian, in terms of the way they address the global challenges confronting them. which of these systems might be best equipped to meet these challenges? Is the strongest system with all that implies something which the world's citizens want? If not, what can withstand such unbridled development? This will entail both resistance and dialogue. The one-sided focus of the Bologna process on vocational training can be explained only if we take into account that Great Britain's educational system and the world shaped by that system's principles sees vocational training as the university's primary task. Aggressively forcing the German higher education system to conform with the Bologna reform thus essentially meant giving up Germany's educational tradition or led to a subversion of the Bologna reform, the most common path. We are trying to work, as we always have, but we have also had to make numerous compromises with regards to formalities such as ECTS credits, modules, and other losses of freedom. Furthermore, another peculiarity also plays a significant role that does not apply to the entire higher education system across the world, namely the supposition that German universities not only have a fundamental obligation to teach, but that research also is integral to how universities perceive their role internationally. However, research universities are not the norm, they are the exception. This can be seen, for example, in the United States, where there are roughly 4,800 universities or colleges for just 100 research universities. Due to the special significance of vocational training in international higher education systems, moreover, countries in transitional phases are undergoing extreme massification in their higher education programs. This is also due to the fact that outside the university, career prospects, even for skilled tradespeople, are dim. Of course, those countries that have always had classical educational systems have also been experiencing an enormous increase in students, most recently in German-speaking countries, with an almost 50% increase in young people with a higher education entry qualification. In this respect, the German university system is also part of the globalization process and to a certain extent its victim. The understandable worldwide interest in adequate training and reasonable professional prospects has increased exponentially and has also taken hold in Germany. It did not happen, however, because Germany had no system of vocational training as it is the case in many countries of Southeast Asia. It happened because people failed to recognize that the German so-called dual system provides vocational training of a very high standard, and due in part to the completely inappropriate accusations launched by the OECD with regard to participation in higher education in Germany, a significant proportion of successive generations of students have now chosen university education and not the dual system. This happened on the one hand because of concern about professional prospects, on the other, no doubt, because of concerns about reputation and prestige, which are in turn very closely linked to the former. It is not hard to recognize, however, that by adapting to the Bologna system, German universities largely fail to offer suitable vocational training and cannot but fail to do so because, at least within the university sector, institutions have simply transformed classic university curricula from the pre-Bologna German university system to conform to the curricula used within the Bologna system. Against this backdrop, the question with regard to the continental European system's place in the future, and especially the question as to what it can offer, are highly significant. Being able to offer something in line with our understanding of higher education, however, depends not just on the question of vocational education, but on the place of continental European higher education system occupies in an international higher education system generally. The question will naturally arise as to whether the German university system vocationalizes to the detriment of the dual system, or whether we can succeed in strengthening the German, or more accurately, the continental European view of the university to such an extent that it may influence the emergence of a world university system. After all, the continental European view of the university, which has been significantly corrupted, if not entirely sacrificed by the Bologna process, has provided a guiding principle for modern democratic social systems and basic human rights. To assess this development by looking at its conditions is to ask in which ways the changes in the international university system may be a part of a larger process of global change affecting the international society as a whole. It is with alarm that we are currently witnessing all over the world, including Europe, new nationalisms, some with fascist features. Thus, we can see a process of globalization involving, on the one hand, convergences, and on the other, local, regional, and national processes of divergence, provided that the institutions implicated in these processes each specifically filter the uncertainty caused by globalization. This thesis has already been proposed in the 1940s by Norbert Elias, who viewed globalization processes and the concomitant regionalization as phenomena of modernity. This thesis is significant for the academic and university system because the potential for a university culture that is not internationally homogeneous depends upon it. This is especially true for Germany, although it is also true for other German-speaking countries and, to a certain degree, for other university systems in the continental European tradition. Accordingly, Elkanah and Klöpper also assume that globalization, I quote, has little influence on elements of local culture and society, which are not directly subject to the forces of global markets, or has even nurtured these by provoking defensive reactions or the purposeful marketing of otherness. End of quote. This naturally raises the question as to what extent market-free societal zones even exist, or, on the contrary, to what extent societal zones might deliberately be regionalized through demarketization in order to preserve values and norms which are deemed indispensable for world process as well. This raises the question as to whether we can identify fundamental differences internationally with regard to an understanding of responsibilities, of goals and processes, and to what extent these, perhaps just minimal differences, might be consolidated into greater clusters characterized tri-specific traditions and meaning. Presumably, this is possible, and we can differentiate thus. Firstly, the aforementioned continental European university tradition, which is native to Western societies and characterized by the humanistic idea of education in an academic context. Second, an Atlantic society tradition which involves a transformation of the continental European tradition in line with pragmatic theory and, above all, as a result of fundamentally different socio-economic starting conditions. Third, a Confucian or East Asian university tradition, which, viewed historically, is about 1,000 years old and emerged from China's specific self-reproducing dynastic tradition, although it spread throughout the East Asian world and currently exercises some influence. The legitimate question as to whether other university traditions, for example, on the Indian subcontinent, in Africa or in South America, should be taken into consideration, can only be answered at the moment in the negative. Prior to colonization by the British and the emergence of the first university institutions in the 19th century, India did not have a comparable tertiary system, and it was in this respect also colonialized. Extensive privatization measures in this sector have seen potentially viable definitions of the university emerge, although these have not been able to make an impact in the rest of the world. As far as Africa and the Near East are concerned, it may also be assumed that, with the exception of the Islamic religious universities, there was no pre-colonial tertiary system in the Arabic or Islamic African world comparable to what we are talking about. The still extant Islamic concept propagated by the Al-Azhar Mosque, which was founded in 988 after Christ, and other Islamic universities, has in principle the potential to become an autonomous and, under certain conditions, influential one. At the moment, however, adaptations of the Atlantic view predominate. Finally, we should look at South America, particularly Brazil. Its many Roman Catholic universities, which are equally informed by religion and existed prior to and now alongside systems which have adapted the Atlantic system, also have a not entirely insignificant status. Due to the pressures of modernization hailing from the north, however, they no longer represent an autonomous university concept, distinct from the three basic concepts to the universities mentioned above. Furthermore, there is a growing dichotomy between state and private institutions, the latter of which now educate roughly 75% of all university students. We could look at still other world regions, such as the Australian system, which is also shaped by the Atlantic tradition. This would reveal the global expanse of the utilitarian, pragmatic approach to higher education. Against the backdrop of these global developments, the question arises, particularly with regard to the future of national systems such as the German one, as to how the relationship between these three basic concepts of post-secondary education will develop. Systems of post-secondary education and vocational training are social systems. When they confront one another in the globalization process, the question automatically arises as to their possible dominance or coexistence. That university system which succeeds in imposing its medium of communication upon others will ultimately be dominant, whether it is a system driven by knowledge or by economics. Whichever system succeeds forces the disappearance of other comparable systems, since these fail to distinguish themselves sufficiently to withstand the dominant forms of communication of the system striving towards dominance. Thus, there are three conceivable courses which a world university system might take in a global competition. The first one, post-secondary educational systems or academic systems could coexist, especially if nationalistic isolation increases. This remains the case and was the case as long as the three large academic and education systems in the tertiary sectors are not or were not dependent upon communication with one another. Historically, this applied to the continental European system of personality formation through active participation in academic research. That was Humboldt's idea, which had not been confronted with any alternative. There was no noteworthy contract to the much older East Asian system, at least none posing a threat to stability. In contrast, around the Meiji Restoration in Japan in the 19th century, the Prussian university model came to have an abiding influence on the East Asian system. Similarly, the continental European system dominated in the 19th century in several classic American universities which had adopted Humboldt's model. To that extent, we can speak of a coexistence of non-communication before the 19th century and of a 19th century phenomenon which in some respects could have led to the collapse of non-continental European systems. This didn't happen. Instead, the American university system in particular responded by intelligently distinguishing itself, creating new forms such as liberal education, as influenced by Humboldt's ideal of general education. Secondly, a university system can, in a confrontation with other systems, gain worldwide dominance, subordinating the others for even forcing their disappearance. The 19th century continental European university system did not pursue any such aim. Rather, East Asian and American appropriations were the product of these systems' own efforts and not any imperial designs on the part of continental Europe. Today, however, The case is otherwise with regard to the Atlantic system. The United States began at an early stage to practice a kind of worldwide university imperialism, among other things, by establishing international American universities. By founding these, it has tried to gain a foothold in various regions of the world. The early concept, the first international American university, was founded in Cairo, Egypt in 1919. This early concept continued to be pursued following the rise of a new world order at the end of the Second World War. It is interesting, however, that this did not happen in continental Europe, whose understanding of the university, based on an almost 1,000-year-old tradition, remained stable, but had difficulty competing with those countries outside of Europe committed to the American way. For example, this applies most recently to Iraq and its Minister of Higher Education and Scientific Research, Ali Mohammed al-Hussein, Ali al-Adeb, who sought to found a second American university in Baghdad, in addition to the one in Sulaimania, for the following reason. I quote, "Students here would be broadly educated in the liberal arts and sciences, but with depth in those areas that will lead to successful careers in Iraq and the region." End of quote. More recently, the United States have continued with efforts to establish the Atlantic system worldwide. For example, in 2011, the American Council on Education published a study entitled "Strength Through Global Leadership and Engagement," which is dedicated to the question how to save the US advantage in global higher education, and which would like to see American higher education as a global leader. The study analyzes the decreasing number of university-educated US citizens in comparison to the number of university-educated students in Asian countries and the decrease in scholarly publications between 1981 and 2009 in comparison to those in the Asia-Pacific region and the European Union. It further identifies a decrease in the number of international students in the American share of the world university market. This analysis goes hand in hand with the diverse crises Hans Weiler has identified in the American university landscape: a financial crisis, a crisis of competition, a political crisis, and a crisis of meaning. In a slightly less aggressive manner, in 2012, the US Department of Education published for the first time a strategy for the education sector entitled "Succeeding Globally Through International Education and Engagement." The study leaves in no doubt that the goal is global success. It tries, however, to put benchmarking procedures and educational diplomacy in its own internationalization efforts in the foreground, among other things by strategically including international education experts. There can be no doubt that the Atlantic academic and university understanding is the very one which has become, due to geopolitical as well as expansionist process in education, the most widespread in the last several years, if not the last 1.5 centuries with regard to Great Britain, even if American education policy literature expresses patently unjustified concern about a possible loss of dominance in this area, it is clear that the Atlantic university system, through different mechanisms, already dominates to such an extent that the continental European and the East Asian systems must make extraordinary efforts to validate some of their own features on a worldwide basis. Several mechanisms are at work. As far as continental Europe is concerned, it is clear that the Bologna process as a fundamental university reform has been decisively influenced by the British and backed by decades of Anglo-American academic systems in places like Scandinavia or the Netherlands. The introduction of employability as a criterion, the conviction that imparting of skills is the goal of university instruction, and the introduction of degrees within a three-tiered system, BA, MA, PhD, in addition to many other aspects of the Bologna process, are purely Atlantic in origin. It is only a second glance upon implementation that they collide with the continental European understanding of the university and academia. It remains to be seen whether these formal changes so deform classic academic curricula that these are sacrificed on the altar of utility. For utility is the real purpose of education according to John Locke's pedagogical realism or Dewey's pragmatism. By the dominance of the three-tiered university system, as well as by the decades-old prevalence of engineering and the natural sciences, the Confucian understanding of education could be significantly affected. It also remains to be seen whether the East Asian Confucian commitment to social harmony, which must be the aim of any form of education, has a chance of survival. The threat to the continental European and East Asian academic and educational traditions seems to lie in the notion of utility, which was fed and legitimated by the high degree of economization and all existential concerns following the collapse of the East-West divide. Viewed systemically, the university system, influenced by the Atlantic understanding, is altering its code of communication. Education is no longer guided by the question of whether knowledge is true or untrue. It is guided by economics and the question of whether something pays or does not pay. But put simply, the determination of whether or not something belongs to the Atlantic academic understanding, which is striving for dominance, lies not in whether an utterance is true or false, but in whether or not you can earn money from it. In principle, there is only a third way out of the structural trap which arises when a university system is either excluded from the globalization process or compelled to yield to the communication rules of the market in accordance with the Atlantic model. The alternative would be to find, beyond coexistence and dominance, a common world university system which on the one hand relies upon consensus about basic rules for academic systems, and on the other permits divergent interpretations and approaches which do justice to the diversities of regions, milieus, and customs. This third way would require the three large types of university and academic systems to have. If possible, a historically saturated set of beliefs or convictions, and to have views of the future upon which consensus can be reached. These underlying beliefs can essentially be divided into 6 categories within which, at least within Europe, unity must be the aim. First, the theory of the university. This forms a continuum characterized by the answer to the question, cui bono? The university serves the individual or society. In a market-oriented university, there is a demand for innovation research, but for basic research only to the extent that it promises to create the conditions for innovation. For the classical university, there was a simple solution to this dilemma: neither nor, meaning the university serves neither just the individual nor just society, but rather both, by committing exclusively to the pursuit of science and scholarship for their own sake. Thus, we can suppose that both the individual and society will profit from this science and scholarship in otherwise undefined ways. In this case, today's much discussed problems with regard to the quality of staff, the classroom, and graduates do not even arise, for if a passion of knowledge is the priority, we do not need to worry about quality. The first category for comparison must therefore be the basic understanding of what a university is. Second, the meaning of education, or Bildung in German. On the continuum between general education and vocational training, the market-oriented university tends towards vocational training and careers. This was not the case in the classical university. On the contrary, university professors and teaching staff with a vocational orientation were betitled as bread and butter scholars, pursuing their work simply to make ends meet. Thus, it was also clear that the reproductive learning was secondary to productive learning, today something we could call learning by discovery. The best way to make learning by discovery possible is to integrate students into research. That is, to let them be part of these discoveries. Today's challenges, which are related to the problems arising from the standardization of curricula, the question of the international nature of coursework, the language of instruction and teaching methods, all the way through to mass instruction via massive open online courses, MOOCs, are the linear consequences of the concept of education we have chosen. Third, university access. If university teaching serves to provide a general education, then we must answer the question of how to grant access differently from the way we would if we were discussing a vocational institution. Thus, university access is the third category for our systems comparison. This issue has become all the more urgent as demographic developments all over the world are varied, or have varied. Decreasing birth rates in Central Europe raise the specter of having to activate talent reserves, as it is called, while in systems in which attending university is the only path to a career, scarcity of human capital is not the problem, but rather the scarcity of higher education institutions to accommodate the growing number of applicants. The university access category thus also marks a continuum in this case, ranging from access for all to access for only a few. Addressing this question of access to university implies as well addressing the question of educational fairness because it bears upon the questions of a fair or just life, of diversity with regard to eligibility, of social mobility, and so on. For the problem to access, the classical university had already found a solution outside its own system, the university entrance qualification that could be attained in the secondary school system, precluding the selection problem entirely. Whoever had an Abitur in Germany could study. Thus, the solution was to externalize selection. The problem became re-internalized only when the institutional resources no longer sufficed, and other measures such as numerus clausus in Germany, that is a restricted admission, or the ability to pay in the countries of the Atlantic system were introduced to govern access. Fourth, university autonomy and academic freedom. If research and training and learning through research are based on the logic of scientific and scholarly pursuit and not on the logic of society or the individual, then the logic of scientific pursuit requires protection. It is too easy, as the founders of the university understood at the dawn of the 19th century, for science and scholarship to become bound to other interests, whether the church at the time or the market today. On the continuum from academic freedom to state control, the classical university thus sided clearly with the cause of academic freedom. This necessarily led to the idea of academic self-governance, at least in the German universities, but also in other continental European university systems. Fifth, differentiation in the post-secondary system. Among the problems we face is the question being asked all over the world, namely whether the tertiary sector should be characterized by comprehensive universities or specialized universities with particularly vocational profiles. Similarly, there are contrasting concepts regarding the type of universities with regard to the local and universal. On the continuum between the comprehensive university, a term that already represents a response to specialization, and the specialized university, the classic system opts for universities. That is the University of Sciences and Scholarship in a single institution. This distinction is significant to a systems comparison. It is also in itself a function of the university's or higher education's basic responsibility to provide people with a broad and comprehensive education or to provide special vocational skills. And sixth, university funding. We could in fact conclude the list of categories at this point if, in the course of the last 200 years, a challenge had not arisen that the Prussian state addressed by providing public funding for what was nevertheless an autonomous higher education system, the category of funding. The moment we can successfully argue that a university education yields significant benefits on the path towards employment and prosperity, which leads to mass applications to study, the question of funding rears its head. Few countries still hold the view that the state must finance the educational system, and thus the future of both society and the individual. Solving the public-private conflict by providing public funding, while at the same time allowing higher education systems the autonomy to govern themselves, has given way the world over to the growing privatization of the higher education system, also in Germany. In essence, it is the Atlantic university model that has prevailed in those countries that have far fewer financial resources as those that are available to Germany. The 6 categories of comparison result from the basic elements of the classical notion of the university. Even a cursory look allows us to see that the world university system continues to face the 6 challenges, although no efforts have been made to find solutions to the contradictions outside the respective dichotomies. This was constitutive for the continental European understanding of the university, based on the theory that supported founding of the Berlin University in 1810. The basic principles espoused in the understanding of the university in Germany and in the few similarly organized systems in continental Europe engender a problem in the globalization process, namely a kind of incompatibility between the continental European and the market-oriented, what could be called Atlantic view of the tertiary sector. The risk to universities all over the world, but especially in Europe, is that they will no longer achieve the goals set forth by the continental European system, and universities will literally be sold out. Seen thus, Europe is trapped. Letting globalization take its course essentially means sacrificing ourselves on the altar of US-American educational imperialism. Conversely, banking on new nationalists may save the continental European university model, but at the price of its distinguishing feature, humanity. It is the job of NGOs such as ECER and ERA and others to find a third way. The first step might be holding a conference in multiple languages, and not just only in English, but by the way, the most widely spoken language in Europe is German, only by the way. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your attention, and welcome once again to your Congress and to Universität Hamburg. Thank you.